Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Some paratext for you. As I was passing through Amsterdam, the customs person asked me, am I going for business or pleasure? And I said, it's a conference. So he said, no pleasure then. But in fact, it's been the most pleasurable conference ever. So thank you everyone for making it so, especially those who have organized it. The title that I'm beginning with is Retelling and Retranslating Yusuf. Of course, the surah itself is a retelling. And every new translation, particularly in English, is a retranslation, as they call it in translation studies. But for me personally, it is also a retranslation because I'll be speaking about an experience that I have undertaken and then something that I'm developing now, which involves going back to the surah and revisiting a lot of those choices. So a little bit about my journey as a translator. I was complaining earlier that many Quran translators decide that the first thing that they will try to translate from Arabic is al-kalam al-mu'jiz al-munazzal lit-tahaddi, right? They're literally choosing the hardest thing that could be thought of as an Arabic text, rather than cutting their teeth with something easy like tafsir Razi. But even before this, while still studying in Egypt, I was translating al-itqan fi ulum al-Quran. We have the chapters relating to language. So Devin had mentioned about Mughni al-Labib, how important the discussion are of these adawat, or these various instruments and particles. So it happens that As-Suyuti has summarized that and I've translated it. So I would add that as well as reading that material, you should in fact translate it to Italian, because it's the best thing you can do as a Quran translator is struggle with the theoretical apparatus before you then apply it to something like a tafsir or to the Quran itself. So this was volume 1. This is the La Pira Library's copy actually. And after that, I was commissioned within the same project, which is run out of Jordan, to do another volume which would incorporate 5 surahs not chosen by me, but fortuitously, the first of those surahs was Yusuf. And it brought some amazing opportunities and challenges. One of the things along the way while translating the actual content of the tafsir is you need to supply a Quran translation in English. And if I used something that existed, first of all, I would find it insufficient or frustrating. But more particularly, there's the problem of the compatibility between the Quran translation and what the mufassir is actually saying. So if it doesn't match his perspective and his explanation, then the translation is competing with the mufassir, and there are some publications that actually do this. So I started to think at this point, what would it look like to have a Razian translation of the Quran? I haven't undertaken that, in fact. There is somebody who's publishing a series on Tafsir al-Baydawi in English, and he has actually talked about having a Baydawian rendering. And I'm going to talk to you about Ibn Ashur's, which I call the assured translation. By the way, every pun is intended, because if you don't intend it, you don't get the reward, right? Okay, so as a bit of an aside, this is a little bit of a presentation of Tafsir al-Razi as I've been teaching it through an online course. I haven't yet got to the point of publishing it in book form. But this is an attempt to sort of break down the anatomy of a tafsir and to reconstitute it according to the principle of the question and answer, which in a way al-Razi to some extent does that out loud. Otherwise, you can go back and see, the question here is, what is the story that's occurring here in this verse? What is this point of language and how should it be explained? What is this theological question that's being addressed? These are recurring things from verse to verse. And then on the right, you can see also some questions that are maybe particular to this verse. But seeing it in this way prepares you then to dive into the various things, especially things that interest you most, or to get an overview of the concerns of the exegetes. But anyway, that is an aside, just to maybe put it into your mind that this is something that is possible. So I'm going to speak here about my first foray into Quran translation as such. This is a picture of me wearing somewhat Azhari clothes. I'm sitting next to Nouman Ali Khan. You may know about him, or you may have to Google and find out. He's a very popular speaker and teacher, celebrity even. Here we are in Jakarta. So sometimes I've had the opportunity to go to different parts of the world and sort of be in the background, and I help him with tafsir and I help him think through ideas. Then along came COVID, and at that point, Ramadan also arrived. And so it was a question of what could we do at this time that would sort of capture the moment and capture people's imagination, and what could be a good series to go online. And I actually thought, you know what, let's do Surah Yusuf. And he doesn't know this, but the reason was I was thinking, that shouldn't be too much work because I already translated Tafsir al-Razi. I know all about Yusuf. So we just have to, I'll basically give him the information that I already know. So of course, fortunately, it was a lot more interesting than that. It was a new dive into the surah, both for him and for me. We both encountered many things that we hadn't thought about before, while trying to look at the commentary before even we're thinking about translation as such. Naturally, when you're commenting upon something from the Quran in a language other than Arabic, translation is always there. But a lot of times it's a kind of oral translation, ad hoc translation, flexible. You can actually throw in multiple synonyms. You don't have to worry about which one goes down on the page. But then after that whole process, where there were plenty of lessons, they are all available online on YouTube and so on, we then undertook a process of translation. And at first, I have to say, I was skeptical about undertaking this work. I, even at this point, did not really feel that there was much to add. I feel strange saying that now because I'm now very, very convinced that there's a lot to add. But at the time, I definitely didn't think so when we began. But then it felt really good. It felt really amazing to be actually solving some puzzles and sometimes putting something in new words that we haven't seen or heard before. And that's one of the principles that we've undertaken here, a heavy reliance upon what is in the tafsir, so not overlooking anything if possible. Thinking about the balagha of the Quran, not just as the mufassirs actually say, but the principles that they adhere to then might lead us to other insights. But also fluency. We've been talking about native fluency. Both of us are native speakers of English. And that's the side of the advantage and the strength that we bring. Other side of things obviously comes through study. Freshness, not novelty for its own sake, but where possible, where appropriate, why not give a new expression that just gives you something else to see, something else to hear, rather than what's commonplace? Because I think it's very important that we don't think that when we're undertaking a translation that we're trying to replace all the other translations. I do think people still do that and still claim that, even in the introductions, rather than adding something, another dimension, another way of experiencing it, which can complement other things, right? So I don't think we can expect one translation to do all the work, right, and achieve all the things and make you feel all the feelings and inform you of all the different possibilities. If it can, then this would be i'jaz as well. Collaboration. I won't say too much about the whole process, but collaboration is a challenging thing. You're doing that now. The two of us, we had to compromise and fight out a lot of things. He's a bit older. I would give him, the final decision in a lot of things. What was particularly challenging was we did this translation in full view. This is not my preference, but Norman actually wanted us to do them as live streamed translations, an intensive sort of 10-day process that we did for, after having done actually about 30 verses, we then did a 10-day intensive, each session about 3 hours, broadcasting live as we're discussing the translation, debating and reading and agreeing and putting something down. If we're saying, okay, we've got a problem here, what could be a word for this? Then, why not ask widely? Why not try to get people's perspective on it? And then, of course, many times translators go and try to solicit that kind of feedback after the fact. So yeah, this video that you can actually find online, I'm reciting the Arabic and he's reciting the English. So I think a lot of viewers think that he's the translator and I'm just some guy who's a qari, but it's my translation as much as his. But it's interesting, there's a lot to reflect on in this performance that we did. I felt it was a very straightforward thing that we did, but it's actually quite unique. It's not typically done, especially with people's own translation. In Arabic, when you recite, there is artistry, there is performance, but it's also constrained by certain things. the rules of tajweed, norms. In English, just like we're talking about the written form, how you can actually do certain things in the translation that you couldn't really manage or get away with in Arabic, same thing applies when reading it aloud. Tone suddenly becomes extremely important. It comes into play. Anyway, I'm going to talk about this translation of Yusuf. Unfortunately, the project as such that we were undertaking is paused. I hope it will not be like Thomas Erpenius of 1617, that it ends at Surah Yusuf. But if it does, at least I will have done other things in the other translations. Right, so I've picked out a few things which I consider highlights or things that I would like to highlight for you. And in the beginning, the examples that I've chosen here are things that I think are the result of attention to tafsir. And that's one of the things that I'm an ambassador for. Tafsir, tafsir, tafsir. The importance of making use of it, right? Sometimes we feel like, oh, why should I be constrained by it? Well, I'm going to talk about self-constraint, much like Shawkat pointed out. You know, you make a choice as to what's important to you. But what we mustn't do, I think, is just neglect it. Just be unaware that people have, in fact, thought about these questions, talked about them, reached conclusions, debated with each other, and then we're coming along perhaps many centuries later. So here in نحن نقص عليك أحسن القصص, I very much like to say that it's the best told story, or rather, you know, I maybe lean towards the view that this is not specifically about Yusuf, but it's about the stories of the Quran in general. And then because it's being said here, then it's highlighting Yusuf in particular, isn't it? But this is a very well-supported thing in tafsir, which is to say, they say, Ahsan al-Qasas is in the position of the masdar or the maf'ul mutlaq. So, نقص أحسن القصص, نقص قصصا, we're telling the story, a telling, right? And then أحسن القصص modifies it. So that's where our translation says, we are going to lay the story out for you in the finest way. That is in Tafsir al-Razi, is in Tafsir al-Baydawi, it's actually all the way through the tafsir. But when I have surveyed the existing translations, none of them thought of doing that. None of them, or if they thought about it, they decided against it. It's always the fairest stories, the best of stories, most beautiful of tales or chronicles, or there's a variation in these words, but never in the grammatical understanding. Except Muhammad Asad, but Muhammad Asad understands qasas in a different way. He says, we will explain the Quran to you in the best way, right? But Muhammad Asad at least was thoughtful in that respect as to how it's constructed. The second thing, the well, into the dark hole of the well, غابة الجب. Here we have a grammatical issue. Where is the jawab or the apodosis of lamma, right? Of when. So when they finally took him away and gathered resolve to get him into the dark hole of the well, something happened. So typically what happens is the translator chooses to see the gathered resolve part, they resolved, as the apodosis. Or they see وَأَوْحَيْنَا as the apodosis. We inspired him. Now, an argument can be made, but it's tricky because of the presence of the waw in both cases. وَأَجْمَعُوا وَأَوْحَيْنَا. So the other possibility, and perhaps a stronger possibility grammatically, is that the jawab is mahdhuf, it's elliptical, there's something which is unstated. So our translation leaves here a gap, right? A gap like the well, into the dark hole of the well, and then there's a dash because there's something which is not supplied verbally, but is supplied instead by your imagination. So the implication can be, and when they resolved to get him into that well, something happened which is just too horrible to mention. Meanwhile, we inspired him, right? So there's like a big ... which is very much intended, at least again, according to many of the tafsirs. This is one of my nice discoveries, I can say, in verse 36, where he says, "Inni arani a'siru khamra." I see myself pressing wine. The translation I don't think looks remarkable. I think probably a lot of them say it like this, but we thought about it more and then wrote the same thing, right? Because what happens here is the exegetes say, you don't press wine, do you? I mean, if you pressed wine, it would just splash everywhere. So it means I press grapes that will become wine. So they said, well, in the dialect of Oman, khamr means grapes. So maybe for some unexplained reason, in the Hijazi Quran talking about Egypt, the Omani dialect is used here to describe the grapes. Or they say, and this is a nice way, it's a metaphor, it's majaz mursal, because it's going to become wine, so you can call it wine from the beginning. I'm pressing grapes for wine. Yeah, that's fine. But then, as I realized in Genesis 40, verse 11, the description of the dream is exactly like this. I take some grapes and I squeeze them directly into the cup of the king, right? So it's a'siru khamra. So maybe the Quranic expression is just saying all of that in the most concise expression, pressing wine. It's a dream, remember. It doesn't really happen that way, but in a dream, anything can happen. The other one that we have here, this is one that I could elaborate more on, the grammar problem here. But the crux of it is the use of the word lawla. Many of the translations have assumed something about lawla, which is not the meaning of lawla, and not one of the known meanings of lawla. And I think many of the translators, it seems, were unreflective about lawla, right? Which generally is, were it not for this, then that would have happened, right? So it's this kind of conditional. So many have assumed that you can read this backwards, like, if it wasn't for the fact that you call me senile, I would smell Joseph, right? Or I would say that I smell Joseph. Many of them have done this. But in fact, he's very emphatic about it. Inni la ajidu riha Yusuf. So if we go to a tafsir like Zamakhshari, and then all those who followed him in this, they say that jawab is mahdhuf. There's a new sentence. I do smell Joseph. And then a new sentence. Were it not for the fact that you call me senile, then something. Now here's the something that we have to fill in. So most of them say, if it were not for the fact you consider me senile, you'd believe what I'm saying. You'd hear me out. But I think there's a better possibility that I'll come to later on. When it came to ala basiratin, insight with insight upon insight from insight, it's not really the meaning of basira. If you go to the tafsirs, again, they will say it means like evidence. And the use of ala for tamakkun, being firmly established upon something. So I ended up with, from a position of full clarity. But then I brought insight back for the word ibra, which comes later. The stories are a source of insight. Okay. The other example I have here from verse 110 is to do with the word وَظَنُّوا أَنَّهُمْ قَدْ كُذِبُوا. And there's another canonical reading, I'll be talking about Qira'at a little bit later, which is وَظَنُّوا أَنَّهُمْ قَدْ كُذِبُوا. Now remarkably, a lot of the translators have assumed that this says كُذِبُوا, or they've acted as if it says كُذِبُوا, or they just thought that كُذِبُوا means the same as كُذِبُوا. None of the above are true. كُذِبُوا is one thing, and كُذِبُوا is another thing, to the extent that كُذِبُوا caused a bit of trouble in exegesis. To the extent that Aisha reportedly, when asked about this verse, says, how dare you say it's كُذِبُوا? No, كُذِبُوا, because كُذِبُوا results in a meaning which is terrible. The messengers thought that they had been lied to. This is blasphemous. The messengers thought that they'd been lied to. So there are a few ways to resolve that. One of the ways is to see the pronouns as not referring to the messengers anymore. That is the way that we have done it. The messengers gave up hope and their people came to think that they had been lied to. That's one of two resolutions that Razi presents. But a lot of the translators, I think, either missed the difference between كُذِبُوا and كُذِبُوا, or decided that it doesn't matter, or they decided that, you know what, I'm just going to quietly translate nafi'. What's the worst that can happen, and who's going to ask, right? Because they don't ask, people don't ask. This is what I call the great switcheroo, where basically one qira'ah is brought here instead of the other one, without any footnote or anything announcing it. But generally, I think it is not done on purpose. And similarly, فَنُجِّيَ مَن نَشَاء, in the same verse, a lot of the translations are as if it says, فَنُنْجِي man nasha. But this is slightly more defensible than the other one. We talked a little bit about tone. Let me just mention something about choices that we've made in this translation. So with dialogue, we tended to use a slightly more informal register. So obviously it's a choice. I do actually like the theory that you mentioned from Sana Jamal about the devil is speaking here. You know, if I elaborate on that, you know, the comparison with Dar al-Nadwa, the devil even shows up in person as a strange man. You know, here I like to think that they're all in a circle and then he's just standing behind them going, kill Joseph. Right? And the suggestion seems to come from nowhere. It's like a disembodied, you know, Yusuf, right? So they get the idea from somewhere, but then nobody's to blame. You know, who really said that? It wasn't me. And later on, all deniability will be there. No, nobody really suggested it because قَالَ قَائِلٌ مِّنْهُمْ. So this is like a more purposeful statement. But before that, it's almost like, who knows? That was just a really bad idea, whoever said that later on. Here in verse 85, just jumping ahead again in the story, these are the brothers speaking to Yaqub, to Jacob. And many of the exegetes take this to be an expression of pity. They say shafaqa. قالوا تالله تفتأ تذكر يوسف حتى تكون حرضا أو تكون من الهالكين. Now when you're reciting in Arabic, you know, I'll have to check the video, how did I do it, but it's quite hard to really use tone in the same way as we can in translation and in English. Tonal languages will have their own things as well. We can use maqamat, we can use sort of like sad kind of maqam in the melodic scale, verses, different types. But in English, it's very easy to lean into a tone. And in writing, you can embed tone into it. So here, you can see that Norman and I didn't have such a sympathetic view of the brothers and their shafaqa. We don't really think they're being sympathetic here. So our translation is like this. They cried, by God, you're really going to keep on about Joseph until you're wasting away, or even to the point of death. So it's a chiding statement. But that's a lot to do with not just how you read the words in this verse, but how you read the story and what you've assumed about their motivations. So yeah, I'm much less sympathetic to the brothers than many of the exegetes. Is it okay to have fun? Okay, so fun, Arabic word, English word, right? This tells you what I'm all about, really. This is what I'm known for on Twitter, actually, not for like academic stuff. It's the bilingual puns. So here, for example, and I noticed that actually Shawkat did this. It was a tawfiq. It was just a divine gift that he did this, that we wish him well, we wish him only well. So they've said, you know, we are his well-wishers, as we wish to put him in a well, right? So what's happened here is they're betraying something about their hidden motivations and their evil intention towards Joseph. Now, is that purely gratuitous, or can it come from somewhere? Well, in the story, you can maybe see little indications of the fact that they're betraying their intentions a little bit. When they say, وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُؤْمِنٍ لَنَا وَلَوْ كُنَّا صَادِقِينَ, you can read that innocently, you know, even if we're truthful, you don't believe us. Or you can read it more like, even if we were truthful, you wouldn't believe us, right? So it's almost like they're giving away something from themselves. Even I heard one scholar say like this, that when in recitation, there's this thing called ishmam, مَا لَكَ لَا تَأْمَنَّ, and if you weren't looking, you won't have heard anything. But there's a little indication with the lips in this word because of an elided noon that's at the core of the issue. So تَأْمَنَّ. So someone has made this kind of perspective, you know, hypothesis that this indicates something about the hidden intentions behind the words that they're saying. Why aren't you trusting us? Yeah, right? Something like this. You'll notice that we've used the word dad here. So I was actually discussing with the Shawkat because in the 2018 draft, he had their daddy. And I remember when I saw that, I was quite taken aback. But it certainly led to a thought process as to what are the expressions that we feel comfortable with, uncomfortable with, why do we feel that way, how are these things culturally relative, And there's quite a few people, I think, who saw this in our translation and quickly made judgments about the whole translation. That this is just, oh, that's what you're all about. You're like, Dad. Everything's, you're just trying to dumb down the English language and make the Quran into American vernacular and so on, which is not the purpose at all. As I've tried to argue, we actually are paying a lot more attention to certain points of specificities in tafsir. But the idea of Dad is you're trying to aim for something that is respectful and affectionate at the same time. Oh, my father, or oh, father, dear father, father of mine. You know, it's always set in a sort of Victorian novel. It's quite Dickensian. And maybe that's the best that we can do. I was saying to Shawkat that, you know, in some of our cultures we say Abuji is actually for me like such a nice correspondence to Ya Abati. If I could just write Abuji, that's from my background, you know, South Asian. But in an English translation, maybe it wouldn't work. So anyone who's watching this and doesn't like Dad, I give them permission to read something else on top of it, right? Just see the rasam of Dad and read it as whatever for you is your way of addressing your father respectfully. The muckraking. This is one of the things I'm most proud of, and it's demented. So this is about what I call the housewives of Heliopolis, right? These wives of some say the cupbearer, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. And they have been saying, you know, talking trash about Mrs. Aziz, okay, as I also like to call her, not in the written translation, but informally, I call her Mrs. Aziz. So they have been gossiping, but then the verse says, when she heard about their makr, and makr is supposed to be a plot, a secret plan. So some of the exegetes say, well, they were actually plotting to get a chance to see Joseph. That's one solution. Others said, no, gossip is called makr because they share something which is secretness, the secret gossiping, secret plotting. So it's just like transferring the words. But then, you know, going back to the political perspective, as Thomas was raising this problem, you know, seeing the story through a political lens, these are wives of other people who might be important somehow, but they're not the Aziz. So noticeably, who's the first people who do use the word Imra'atul Aziz? It's them. Imra'atul Aziz Toorawa, the wife of the minister, of all people, has been doing this, and she's madly in love with this boy, right? So it seems that they're actually trying to bring her down, perhaps to bring the husband down, to try to raise them. So this is another possibility. This is a makr, this is actually intrigue and plotting. So I reached for the word muckraking, and the reason is because it's got the word makr in it, and for nothing stronger than that. Muckraking is trying to find out people's dirty secrets in order to cause trouble for them, especially in political contexts, right? So this is what I call gymnastics, right? So we have Arabic ginas, and then you do a play into another language. This is gymnastics, yeah? And it's, you know, it's a word that applies to itself, right? A few others that I didn't put up, but it's not gymnastics actually, but just sort of taking something from the etymology, right? So in one of the verses where she says, Al-ana hashas al-haq. You know, if you look in the dictionaries, it says something about stripping off of hair or skin. So it said, no, the truth is laid bare, right? So this is a you know, ishara pointing to this etymology. Some that didn't make the cut, you know, the band of brothers, the band is quite good because the usba is something to do with like binding together, right? So matters get done and tied up, right? So I wanted to say we are strapping lads, right? But it was too Scottish and it wasn't accepted by the committee. So after the experiment of the translation, I wrote some papers more on the theory of Quran translation. One of them is actually a kind of reflection on that project, and also what I found has been left untranslated in existing translations, right? So I'm a little bit poking fun at the trope of the untranslatable Quran. There's always a paper or talk every month or two with this title, Untranslatable Quran. Quran is untranslatable, and yet we keep translating it, so something's happening, clearly. But I am suggesting here that there are things within the Quran that don't get translated, right? And even I'm not even going in the direction that Shawkat has done in that respect. But even in terms of opinions that mufassirs have written about in Arabic, like Ahsan al-Qasas, the translators just overlook it, leave it aside, and so it has the potential to be translated, it's just untranslated, right? So one of the horizons of that is the multiple readings, the Qira'at, which I'll do a little bit about shortly. So I am arguing for the need for tafsir literacy, paying attention to the genre, and I will be actually talking about more than that, which is getting really stuck in with a particular tafsir, in my case, the tafsir of Ibn Ashur, in what I call predetermined exegetical translation. This is in my other paper, which is coming out apparently next month in Qatar. So this is an aside, but just something to maybe think about. The multiple qira'at of the Quran, I'm not necessarily suggesting one must incorporate them into translation. There are some arguments that I've made, whether in the paper that I mentioned, some talks that are here on YouTube at the Ibn Ashur Centre channel. One of the papers that was delivered actually here in Palermo with Marijn van Putten, you can see the third one there. So what I am suggesting is not to be ignorant about qira'at, not to be ignorant about the fact that when you come to certain junctures, there are multiple readings here. So choosing your direction consciously, this is important. So you can choose to be normative. On Twitter one time, I coined the term hafsonormative. Actually, I did that in a talk at AAR. Hafsonormativity. And people started to use it in actual serious journal papers now, and they're citing like that guy off Twitter in the footnote. But the key sign that it's become an important term is that people have misunderstood and misusing it, right? So what I mean by hafsonormativity is not just the fact that the reading of Hafs and Asim is dominant, but it's just the practice or the mistake of thinking that Hafs equals Quran and then overlooking what happens when you see the Quran is obviously more complex than that and having other readings that perhaps ought to be taken into account. So I've told you about my connection with Quran.com. One of the projects that we have at the moment is to produce what I'm calling here the Qira'at fact files. There's no pun in that, that's just what they're called, Qira'at fact files, where wherever there is, for example here Maliki and Maliki, just to clearly document that for those who are interested to see about this information, and then to explain what implication does that have for the translation, how might they be understood differently, at the same time how can they be understood together, are they compatible, do they boil down to much the same thing, as I would say Maliki and Maliki do, but they probably should be translated differently if you are paying attention to that. So here's a little idea about some quote-unquote missing translations of Surat Yusuf. What's missing if we don't go beyond Hafs? So in verse 12, will we miss that? Yarta'i wa yal'ab is often explained to come from ra'i, which is grazing, either to say we're going to graze, or he's going to graze the animals, right? Take them to pasture, or it's an expression for ourselves, we're going to graze like animals, we're going to eat like beasts, right? So that is actually how one of the ways it's understood, from narta'i wa nal'ab, because that will change he to we also, right, in these various readings. Al-mukhlasin versus al-mukhlisin. It's quite subtle. Purified versus sincere. But, they can actually be, resolved with each other. Haythu yasha, haythu nasha, wherever he willed, wherever we willed. Not an earth-shattering difference. In the end, the story remains the same, but it looks different in translation, doesn't it? Men whom we inspire or men who are inspired. Nuhi ilayhim is Hafs and Asim, but only Hafs and Asim. So the vast majority of readers say yuha ilayhim in the passive, in the sort of more abstract way. Afala ta'qilun, afala ya'qilun. Obviously different. What you understand, what they understand. وَظَنُّوا أَنَّهُمْ قَدْ كُذِبُوا. They thought that they were lied to. Someone thought that they were lied to. وَظَنُّوا أَنَّهُمْ قَدْ كُذِّبُوا, that they've been rejected, that they've been belied and disbelieved in. It's a different meaning. And likewise, فَنُجِّيَ, they were saved. فَنُنْجِي, we do save. So I'm going to pass this one right now. I'll go the other direction this time. This is a little sample from my current project, which is what's called the assured translation. Yes, pun very much intended. So it is according to the tafsir of Ibn Ashur, so it's assured translation, or the bigger project we might call the light of assurance, taken from At-Tahrir wa Tanweer, which is the title of his tafsir. So by now you gathered that I'm into this guy and his work. The center, Ibn Ashur Centre, which I founded, is not all about him. In fact, we took his name as an inspiration, as someone who is thoroughly grounded in the Islamic exegetical tradition and generally the scholarly tradition. At the same time, was a person of ijtihad and a person of original views in tafsir in particular. So this kind of spirit, this balance, of old and new, of respect and boldness, is something that we want to kind of follow in to some extent, right? Including in disagreeing with him sometimes if we have to. So our flagship project, and one that is underway just now, is, on the one hand, you could say it is a Quran translation that is so annotated that it sort of goes beyond the typical realms of Quran translation. On the other hand, if you want, you could see it as his tafsir condensed and abridged so much that it now looks closer to being like a Quran translation. So we're trying to actually work with the material of his tafsir in a way that meets the actual needs of people in a realistic way, but the needs of those who perhaps want to know more, right? Who don't want the bare minimum, who don't want just the translation, but want to actually know about what the tradition says and what some of the best scholarly minds say. So I won't go into explaining who is Tahir ibn Ashur. I have done a 9-minute long film about him in Tunisia. I'll send it to you if you like. But there are some features of the translation work that we're doing, issues of layout and so on, that I'll talk to you about. Very importantly, it's a work that is being conceived of as a digital translation at the same time as, or even over and above, its presence as a print work. So we are thinking about the book format. What I'm showing you from Surah Yasin is a sample of what it could look like as a page. Already, I'm dissatisfied with what we did and looking at maybe other ways to set things out. But digitally, there's so many possibilities that are so delicious and tempting. The idea of being able to overlay different possibilities and opinions and allow the reader, the user, the explorer to come and interact, to have a tactile experience. Now it's all not even these screens, but these screens, right? So you come to a verse and you say, okay, I can see here there is an option being presented to me. Let me tap, and it will change and show me another possibility in the verse, right? And within this project, that's guided by the scope of the things that Ibn Ashur considers to be right interpretations. So one thing I highlighted there on that slide was alternative approaches to authority. I think that, for many people in this room, perhaps the word authority, is maybe not something, a very weighty problem. I would say that for many Muslim readers of the Quran, the question of authority is a hugely important one. But paradoxically, people have got away with a lot. A lot of people have translated the Quran without any authority. Ma anzal Allahu biha min sultan, right? There's nothing. There's the people who did it, who just decided to do it for themselves and didn't even demonstrate that they have qualifications or anything convincing. So they've got away with this. But when pushed on the question, I think many people will say that, yes, we believe that someone should be qualified to undertake Quran translation. If they are going to tell me about the meanings of the Quran, we expect qualifications. We expect them to come from some recognized institution. We expect them to quote the great scholars of the past and not just to read the text and tell me what they personally think about it, which is what many translators do. They just tell you what they personally think. And they're not even all generous enough to give you footnotes to explain their thought process, to explain the fact that I know this is an unusual take, but this is why I think that it means this. No, they'll just do it and then It goes to press, and that's it, right? It's a scandal, to be honest, right? This is the problem. So in this project, the authority of Ibn Ashur as a mufassir, right? Not many translators could claim or would claim that they are a mufassir. Even as a graduate of tafsir from Al-Azhar University, nobody ever suggested to us that we became a mufassir. I think if you do a PhD there, I don't think even then you get to be called a mufassir. I think you have to die, and then you can be a mufassir. That's basically the qualification, among some other things. You write a tafsir and then you die. This is the way to be a mufassir, right? So inshallah one day, right? So the idea here is, by working with his material, we are then drawing upon that authority, while of course I can't take away from the fact that I obviously have to own up to my involvement in it, right? And a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So it's not enough to say, as many translators do, I consulted 20 tafsirs, I consulted 2,000 tafsirs. Are you able to read those tafsirs well? Can you demonstrate to us that you can understand the tafsirs well? Some people demonstrate to us that they misunderstand the tafsirs well, right? Because if they're generous enough to admit where they got it from, we can go and check, and then we say, that's what you misread. So what business did you have? So this is a preliminary kind of approach to setting things out. What you see here is actually what I call the folded up translation, right? This is from Yasin. It's very commonplace, right? You've got the Arabic text because people will expect it. It's in Qaloon, by the way. It's in reading of Nafi' because this is not Hafs a normative project for the most part. Ibn Ashur himself was working off the reading of Nafi' in Tunisia, so the translation primarily reflects that, but also the Arabic text reflects that. At the bottom, we have some notes on the differences that occur with Hafs. But largely, this looks quite normal, because you haven't yet seen this. So here is where we have another layer of information, and this I like to think of as unfolding the translation. So it's things which for Ibn Ashur are somewhat implicit in the text, but here of course we're granted a bit more freedom. I am using a different way of laying it out than brackets, because brackets would be absolutely horrific if we tried to do this many brackets. There is a differentiation here between the things that are more directly present in the language of the verse and things which are additional glosses and explanation. But given the fact that we also have this, then I feel like I've gained the freedom to say, okay, you can have an uninterfered with version here, and then the fully interfered with version here. And then you have some additional pieces which come from his perspective on the structure and so on, like headings which frame the text, which prepare you for what you are encountering. I showed this to some people who said to me, oh, this looks like Tafsir al-Jalalain. So I said, I didn't intend that, but I'm okay with that. So it's like we have created an English Tafsir al-Jalalain, but not based on the Jalalain, because that's another task. Of course, for us, Hamza's work is here somewhere. He translated the Jalalain. That was a great job. But this is a different task. This is almost abridging a big tafsir, like Ibn Ashur's, into something that would then look like the Jalalain, but not via creating an Arabic one of these. Not creating an Arabic one of these, but going directly to this stage into English. Right. So this is maybe the crucial part about sort of moving on. When it comes to Yusuf, I've gone through the whole surah with Ibn Ashur now, and I went through my translation, and I did some para text now. I've scribbled all over it to say this is what's going to change based on Ibn Ashur. So among the things that would change is that he has often talked about multiple meanings that are possible. And in fact, in the 9th of his introductions that he has before his tafsir, he explicitly talks about how he believes that everything that is possible in the text should be considered intended, right? Within reasonable limits. But if there's more than one way to take the verse, then let's do both. Let's not force ourselves to choose. Let's assume it to mean both of those things, right? So if I follow this method, then I'm going to have to show both of these. When it comes to Ahsan al-Qasas, so I've got here verse 3, I have to represent the best storytelling and the best of stories because he believes it to mean both. وَنَحْنُ عُصْبَةٌ, we are a strong band. He also sees as implying, even though we're strong enough to deal with Joseph, right? We're strong enough to deal with him and get rid of him. So that's Ibn Ashur's other layer of reading of the text. So then that would have to be represented in some layer of the translation. We inspire Joseph, you will inform them while they don't realize that it's you. That's the quite common interpretation. He tells us about another way of reading this that he gets from Ibn Atiyah, the Andalusian exegete, which is that we inspired Jacob, not Joseph. وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْهِ, we inspired to Jacob, you must inform them of this. You must let their brothers know, but implicitly. And then they did not perceive that Jacob is receiving this revelation all the way back at home. The Egyptian who bought him said to his wife, or the Egyptian who bought him for his wife said, وَقَالَ الَّذِي اشْتَرَاهُ مِن مِصْرَ لِمْرَأَتِهِ. So it's either اشْتَرَاهُ لِمْرَأَتِهِ or قَالَ لِمْرَأَتِهِ. So the translation would have to reflect both. A very famous one, very thorny one, verse 42. فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ ذِكْرَ رَبِّهِ. So either it means, then Satan made Joseph forget to mention his Lord. Or it means the cupbearer, Satan made the cupbearer forget to mention Joseph to his Lord, which is the king. So this is a famous debate. For Ibn Ashur, he says, let's take both, let's do both. So one led to the other. Satan made Joseph forget, and then as a kind of chastisement, God allowed Satan to make the cupbearer forget to mention Joseph, right? So he wants to see it as both of these meanings are intended, and that's why it is worded ambiguously. The ambiguity is itself intended to give rise to this more complex story. Once I've done Ibn Ashur, I'm not going to then, retire, hopefully, but there'll always be things to go beyond, right? Already in the previous translation, the Bayyinah translation, we had looked at Ibn Ashur and gone beyond. So that's something that I will always want to do, right? Even after doing this constrained project, which I've chosen to do. And many people are saying to me, why are you even doing it? Why don't you just translate the Quran as you want? I said, you'll never understand. And I'll maybe later on try to justify it if you ask me. But I feel it makes sense to do it because it's something different to actually follow a mufassir and take it all the way. It adds something different into the library. But if I was unconstrained, I would love to find ways to represent these things, not just as a play, but even cinematically, right? So this was, for me, a missed opportunity for Ibn Ashur. Another point of ambiguity is who's speaking at this juncture, verses 52 and 53. Is it the wife, is it Mrs. Aziz, who says, I say this so he knows that I didn't betray him, meaning Joseph, behind his back. And I do not call myself blameless. And then she becomes kind of a preacher. Inna an-nafsa la'ammaratun bis-su'. It's a little bit tricky here that she is saying all this, but that is one of the things, and it is also the most connected way to read it. Others say, no, this is Joseph that's saying it. I didn't betray the Aziz behind his back. I didn't do anything with his wife. And I don't call myself blameless because he's being humble. He is blameless, he's a prophet, but he's being humble that, it's only through God's grace that he has stayed away from the sin. But here Ibn Ashur didn't say, why not both, as he did in the previous one. So I'm saying, why not both? But now we'll kind of need a kind of split screen moment on the screen, right? So you almost see them, each one is saying it. One is in the prison, one is in this kind of court in front of the king. They're each saying it, the same words are coming out of their mouths, but they mean different things, right? So I suggest that could be a way of understanding what is actually happening in these verses, right? But in a way, I could only think that way because I've seen some films, halal ones, right? So having seen some films, I'm familiar with the idea of a split screen, so it puts something in my imagination that allows me to read the verse in that way. And then this one here, as well. One of the brothers, some of them say it's Reuben, Kabiruhum. He says, go back to your father and say this and say this and say this. And then suddenly Jacob is replying. So the exegetes point out, okay, at some point the narrative has shifted from Egypt to back home in Canaan. So again, a film kind of scene can do this, where you kind of see them traveling and you hear the voiceover as they're proceeding through the desert. You hear the voices still saying it. And then at the end of the sentence, they themselves are the ones who are mouthing those words, and then the reply comes, right? So if we're going to make another Joseph film, just take these suggestions, right? Okay. I'm really quite obsessed with this part of the story, the kind of part of the ending, the resolution. And I'm also very unsatisfied with Ibn Ashur. I will follow his instructions for the Ashur translation project. I will be suitably deferential in that project. But I really feel that he didn't, use some creativity here that I actually feel that I learned from him, right? So seeing what he's done in other places, I then bring that kind of thought process here to the ending of the story. So try to follow with me. I'm going to rush through some parts of the story. Verse 84, Jacob, وَبِيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ, generally taken to mean he's gone blind or something close to this. It's from grief, is it from just lots of tears make your eyes turn white? Some of them explain it this way. But there's a suggestion, even in Tafsir al-Razi, that this could be this is not his word, of course, but a kind of psychosomatic effect, a traumatic effect. And I'm informed that this is called conversion disorder. Like if you go even to the Wikipedia page of conversion disorder, it says, trauma causes certain effects like blindness is the first one that's even mentioned there, right? So let's maybe run with this idea a little bit. Then verse 93, Joseph obviously has heard about this because he says, take this shirt. I like to think it's the one he was wearing, right? Take this shirt and throw it over his face and he'll be able to see again. So generally it's assumed, so they went and did exactly as they were told. That's a very interesting story. Everything happened exactly as he told. It could be. But then what's the connection between the shirt and coming to see again? Is there some kind of like physical effects, a causative effect? Or is that a pure miracle? Again, both perspectives exist in the works. Crucially, just as they leave Egypt, Jacob says, I can smell Joseph. Here the exegetes seem to miss the fact that this is happening just as they leave Egypt. What's carrying that scent? Come on, right? Don't lose sight of the shirt. You have to keep your eye on it. It's there all the way through this, right? So just as they leave Egypt, Jacob says, I smell Joseph. And then he says, if you didn't think me senile, then something. I said earlier, this is usually explained in tafsir as, if you didn't think me senile, you'd believe me. It's a bit of a tautology. I would suggest here, you smell that? No, you're too busy calling me senile. You're too busy saying al-dalalik al-qadim and all this stuff. If you had an iota of the faith that I have, you would smell what I'm smelling. In fact, if you would just come to the front door, don't you smell that, right? So I want you to see this, deep feeling that Jacob has. And then verse 96. فَلَمَّا أَنْ جَاءَ الْبَشِيرُ. Right, this is understood to mean one of the brothers rushed on ahead, so he gets to be the good news guy. This makes me uncomfortable. As I said, I'm not that sympathetic to these brothers. I know they repented, right? But not yet. They haven't repented yet. He gets to be, hey, Dad, good news. Jacob's alive. By the way, there's a lot I have to fill you in on about what we did and what we didn't tell you about. But I'm the Bashir right now. Here you go. I've always felt a little bit uncomfortable with that, right? Now, ألقاه على وجهه. You can read that in two ways grammatically, right? Razi said the other way is أو يقال ألقاه يعقوب على وجه نفسه. And then he just moves on just like that, right? But this for me is amazing, right? It could be said ألقاه على وجهه. Jacob threw it over his own face. So once I had that in this brainworm, it then developed into something else. Wait, the Bashir. What if it's not one of the brothers? You might see where I'm going now. And then then Jacob's sight is restored by the shirt. And I would like to suggest, and this is implied in Razi maybe, in one of the views, that this is because the joy from that moment reversed the trauma and removed the effects of the trauma. And this is known in the issue of conversion disorder. So last slide now. What is the bashir? The bashir, I suggest, is the shirt, right? I didn't draw this. This is AI generated, okay? I didn't ask for Studio Ghibli, but this is like the default now, right? So the shirt, just read it again now. فَلَمَّا أَنْ جَاءَ الْبَشِيرُ. It's been carrying the good news all the way from Egypt. It's been carrying it in the form of the scent of Joseph, literally maybe perhaps from his back. Yes, there's a miraculous element to being able to smell at the distance, but don't turn it into a shirt from heaven, as they say. Ibn Ashur says, he was smelling the same perfume that he put on Joseph on the day he sent him out to play with the brother. I mean, Ibn Ashur doesn't normally just make stuff up like that, but where did you get this from? Right? From the text, I'm happier to see this. فَلَمَّا أَنْ جَاءَ الْبَشِيرُ is the shirt, as I'm calling it now, the bashirt, right? The bashirt. We have to end on a strong pun. It carried Joseph's scent. It carried the good news that he was alive and in touch, and there was going to be this connection once again. Jacob was smelling it. He was awaiting it. And I like to see that the brothers are deprived at this point of the credit of being the good news bearers. Instead, Joseph takes it to himself. He has that moment with his Joseph. He has that moment with his beloved. And then he can open that conversation and listen to their request for forgiveness. So for me, this enhances the story. I like it. A lot of people I've told like it, but generally, you know, tafsir people or translators, when I tell them, they don't like it and they resist and they say, the context doesn't support it. I've just proven to you that context supports it very nicely. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.